Hello, my name is Amanda Bayley and I'm delighted to have been invited to chair this roundtable discussion on writing string quartets in contemporary Britain, involving 4 of the from home composers, contemporary composers at the Diversity in the British String Quartet Symposium. The roundtable will be divided into 2 parts. In the first part, after I've introduced the composers, they will each talk about their music with some examples for us to listen to. And in the second part, there will be a broad discussion about the challenges composers face and what it means to write string quartets in Britain today. And at any point, if you're listening to this and you'd like to ask questions of the composers about their pieces or about the more general issues we'll be discussing, then please feel free to enter your questions in the chat at any time. Those will be monitored and will feed into our discussions. So I'm going to introduce the composers in the order in which their pieces have been programmed. So first of all, Florence Anna Maunders. And joining just also is Alex Ho. I'll give more formal introductions, the fuller introductions, and we all get to hear about their pieces. So we should have Alex Ho with us here. And also Robert Fokkens. Unfortunately, Jasmin Kent-Rodgman couldn't be with us, but we are going to play an extract from one of her pieces because she was going to be part of this symposium and this roundtable. And of course, her piece is still being performed tomorrow evening. So first of all, then, I'd like to introduce more fully Florence Anna Maunders, whose piece Not Getting Out was performed last night. Hopefully you'll have all seen that. And Florrie started to compose music when she was a teenage boy, and her early tape-based musics from this time reveal an early fascination with the unusual juxtapositions of sounds and collisions of styles, which have been a hallmark of her music making ever since. This is perhaps a reflection of the music which interested her and excited her from a very young age, which includes medieval dance music, electronic minimalism, bebop jazz, Eastern folk music, the music of Stravinsky and Messiaen, and the grand orchestral tradition of the European concert hall. Florrie started out as a chorister, clarinetist, and saxophone player, but following an undergraduate degree at the Royal Northern College of Music, where she studied with Anthony Gilbert, Adam Gorb, Simon Holt, and Clark Rundle, she's enjoyed a mixed and international career as a jazz pianist, orchestral percussionist, vocalist, and teacher. She took a long break from composition, but returned wholeheartedly in 2018 when she came out, transitioned, and over the last few years has enjoyed some enormous success, winning multiple international awards and having her music performed across the globe by a number of prestigious soloists, ensembles, and groups. So I'd like to hand over then to Florrie for her to introduce us to her work and perhaps talk about her piece Not Getting Out that we heard last night.
Hi there, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Amanda. You made me sound like I'm much more competent than I feel I am, maybe. It's great to be here this morning, and thank you for inviting me to come and speak about my music and my work. In particular, I want to share a few words about my piece, and I believe we're going to watch the video and listen to the recording from last night at some point. So I don't want to speak for too long because it's about a 5-minute long performance, so it'd be quite good to hear it in its entirety, to put some sounds to my words. It's always difficult to talk about music without actually hearing the music, so I do want to just say a few things and then really let the sounds speak for themselves. When I'm writing music, I'm very much guided by my ear. I'm not a composer who works with particular systems or particular, what do they call them? The mathematical things, algorithms. My music is very much based on sounds, and I'm very guided by my ear when I'm composing. And because the ear is like a listening thing rather than a kind of, it's an input device rather than an output device. A lot of a lot of my composing practice then is focused around listening. So I guess I do have a little bit of a magpie approach. Amanda just mentioned there in her introduction some of the various influences which are maybe quite strongly apparent in my music. So a lot of what music I write is based on ideas from the music that I hear. I guess my composition process, to a certain extent, is based around synthesizing, combining, and learning from different other musical influences, and then turning those into something new. Ideally, something that doesn't sound anything like its constituent parts. So this piece, Not Getting Out, is in many ways sort of typical of a lot of my composition approaches. So a lot of the pitch material is taken from Arabic maqams, but it doesn't really sound sort of Arabic or North African or Middle Eastern in any way, but it does have this sort of particular quarter tone tuned, I suppose you could call it a scale. It's really sort of melodic shape that you find in a lot of this music. And I don't want to spend ages going about particular maqams. That's like a subject for a whole different lecture. But in particular, there's this idea that you see in a lot of sort of traditional music from around the whole world, really, that one particular pitch is central, and there's always a kind of returning to this pitch. So, you know, there's echoes of this in a traditional Western tonal system, the whole sort of tonic dominant relationship thing. But kind of the original source is more kind of like there is one central pitch that the music is focused on, and everything expresses itself pitch-wise in terms of its relationship to this. Well, I'll call it a tonic. It's not really its role, I suppose. So like the whole first half of my quartet, I think it's quite clear that the music's very much fixed around the note G. And later on it moves to explore D and C before returning to G at the end. And those are, you know, the principal open string sounds of the string quartet. There's a little bit where it works around A as well. But that open G string sound that dominates the sort of first 2 or 3 minutes of the piece. It's very deliberate kind of influence from kind of non-Western musics, I suppose, that it has this central pitch that it comes back to. So the whole concept of this commissioning series was a response to the pandemic that we've all been enduring and still are to a certain extent. And the idea of being stuck in place and not getting out is the kind of extra musical thing that's going on here. So I, like many of us, have been stuck at home and not getting out. I mean, you know, we're not going anywhere at the moment. And in that way, this piece is kind of fixated on certain pitches, but also on certain rhythmic patterns and repetitions. It is full of energy, but it doesn't go anywhere. And that is kind of typical of a lot of my music, I feel. But in this piece, and in a lot of my other pieces as well, there's this surface energy, but the underlying musical processes are not changing. It's kind of, I think some people call it post-minimalist or something, you know. It doesn't have that long-range developmental sort of ambition. It's quite happy to pedal furiously in the same place as exercise bike music. So with this idea of being obsessed with certain pitches and also being obsessed with sort of repetition and these microtonal intervals, you will hear when we listen to this piece that it comes very, very close to this G, particularly at the beginning. So, you know, just a quarter of a tone above the G, or just a quarter tone below, and sort of obsessive repetitions against it. So there's very, very tight intervallic work going on around this G. So it's not kind of approaching from octaves away. It's coming from, you know, intervals of less than a semitone onto this pitch. but it's a consistent sort of tuning system through the whole piece. So it's kind of exploring this sort of major third coming down through quarter tones onto this fixed tonic. It's kind of like the area it's exploring tonally. I don't know how long I've got to talk for, Amanda, really.
That's probably enough, I think, to introduce the piece, if we can now listen to it.
Yeah, I can happily talk forever, but I want to allow some time to hear the piece too. So what I'll do is I'll just mute my microphone and we'll listen through to the piece and then maybe just say 1 or 2 words afterwards.
Great, yeah.
So yeah, there's my not getting out piece. Looking forward to answering any questions about that later. I see there's already some stuff appearing in the questions and answers little chat box. So hopefully people will continue to use that through the morning, and we'll have a good discussion about that later on. So thank you very much, Amanda, for introducing me. Give me a moment to share a few words. I'm happy to discuss later. You're still muted, by the way, Amanda.
Thank you. No, I love the explosive energy that your music's already brought to the, the table. Thank you, Florrie.
Thank you very much.
So moving on then to Alex for now. Alex Ho is a British Chinese composer based in London. He was winner of the George Butterworth Award in 2020 and has had pieces performed and commissioned by the London Symphony Orchestra, Shanghai Philharmonic Orchestra, the BBC Radio 3, Royal Opera House, National Opera Studio, Music Theatre Wales, London Sinfonietta and Roderick Williams. His works are featured at Soundstate Festival, the South Bank Centre in London, Sound Unbound at Barbican, Hearing China at Shanghai Symphony Hall, and Cheltenham Music Festival, the Oxford Leader Festival, and BBC Lake Junction. Alex was joint winner of the Philip Bates Composition Competition in 2016, one of Sound of Music's New Voices 2018, a Help Musicians UK Fusion Fund artist in 2019, and one of the LSO's Sound Hub composers from 2018 to 2020. He's the co-director of Tangram, an artist collective catalyzing transnational imagination and celebrating the vitality of Chinese cultures. Alex is currently studying for a doctorate at the Royal College of Music with an AHRC scholarship. So Alex, perhaps you'd like to introduce your work and give us a taste of a sense of what we might hear in your piece tonight in the concert, which is Our Commonwealth.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much for that introduction, Amanda. And yeah, very grateful to be here today. I was fortunate enough to do my undergrad at Oxford, so really nice to return to this kind of platform, and really enjoyed your piece, Florrie. Congratulations on it, on the premiere yesterday, and really good to hear about your processes and work, that kind of thing. But yeah, I won't chat for too long, because as Florrie said, I do also agree that it's good to listen to the music more than to listen to words about the music. But I guess to introduce the work that I'm interested in, I guess it's often to do with looking at kind of British Chinese identity and that relationship that it might have with Western classical music, which is at times a very a rich and beautiful one, and also at times a very kind of fraught and unbalanced one as well. And so especially the stuff that I'm doing as part of my doctorate at the Royal College of Music, it is kind of looking at both of those sides. And I think those two sides apply to British Chinese identity as a whole. So one being the kind of really exciting potential of merging cultures, or looking at two different categories and bringing them together in all the kind of rough and misaligned ways. But then also looking at the historical baggage of this, the kind of colonial situation, as Ray Chow calls it, between China and the West. And, you know, my parents are from Hong Kong, so a very real kind of colonial relationship there. And so I think it is really important not to forget these kind of historical contexts, despite what kind of curriculum in Britain tries to do that kind of thing. So I guess my music, I like to think, has a kind of social edge to it, and hopefully can kind of represent what being Chinese means today in Britain, especially in a time of COVID, which has, you know, catalyzed a huge amount of racism towards East Asian communities, although that's not actually that new a thing, but it's even worse now. So I'd like everyone to be aware of these kind of issues, that kind of thing. I guess the last thing I'll say before maybe passing on to share a piece of my music is that I've been thinking a little bit more recently about what it means to be a musician in the classical music world, and the ways in which social impetuses or social messages be conveyed or communicated. And so something which I've been trying to do a little bit more is look beyond being a kind of a primary creator of music or a composer of music. And so a large part of what I do as a musician is co-direct Tangram, which Amanda kindly introduced earlier, which is an artist collective which I co-founded in 2019 with a wonderful young chin player, Raylan Yont. And we're a collective made up of researchers, composers and instrumentalists of Chinese and Western instruments, and kind of looking to show the richness of transnational Chinese identity. And so I do think kind of the strands of curation, even talking about music, are so important, particularly today, and long may that continue. So the piece that I thought I would share today is a piece for vocal trio, which is called Chinese Whispers, which I wrote back in 2018, and it was premiered at Cheltenham Music Festival by the wonderful Juice Vocal Ensemble, who are absolutely sublime. And this piece was subsequently broadcast on BBC Lake Junction. And I guess this piece ties together a few of the things I was speaking about just there in terms of kind of the political context between British and Chinese cultures, and how that might meld together in Chinese identity. And so one of the things which is one of my biggest regrets growing up in London is not learning to speak Cantonese properly. I was one of those weird kids who had parents who spoke their mother tongue, so they would speak Cantonese to me, and then I would reply back in English, which is a really silly thing and wish I hadn't done. So now it means that I can understand quite a lot of Cantonese, but my speaking is terrible. And so in 2018, I thought I would try and rectify this by kind of taking formal Cantonese classes. And so this piece, Chinese Whispers, is kind of a meditation on my experiences of learning Cantonese, namely how bad I was at it, but also hopefully showing a glimpse of, I guess, the richness of Cantonese orality. So you'll hear different sounds in the piece that are inspired by the Cantonese language. They're not actually Cantonese words, but really looking at the kind of phonetical richness of the language. So yeah, perhaps that's all I'll say for now, and it'd be great to share the piece. Thank you. Thanks very, very much. And thanks again also to Juice Vocal Ensemble for putting that all together.
Thanks, Alex. And there's a good insight into some of the techniques that you continue to use, as I noticed in our Commonwealth, when we can expect to see vocalizations along with the playing as well. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, it's a quick word on that. I think one of the things which I'm drawn to with voices, especially with instrumentalists who are perhaps less used to using their voice, is that to me, like a voice is a huge like kind of harbinger of identity, because it's the thing which we associate with specific individuals. It's not like you hear a voice and be like, oh, that's a viola player, or you hear a voice, oh, that must be for players of a string quartet. But no, these are actual people, and so that's a theme that I look to draw out a little bit more, in our Commonwealth.
Excellent. We look forward to talking a bit more about that later on then. Now, in the order of things, we would have had Jasmin with us as well, Jasmin Kent-Rodgman, but unfortunately, because she couldn't be in this round table, and we do have a piece of hers to play, but I think because we've already got gaining some interesting questions coming up, I think we might move on to Rob next, and then we've still got Jasmin's piece that we can perhaps turn to later on. So Rob, if you're happy to introduce your piece next.
No problem at all. Well, thank you very much, Amanda. So hello, everyone. Nice to see you all. Thanks for coming along today.
Sorry, Rob, I haven't given you your full introduction. I've got to do this.
Well, you're welcome to. I can introduce myself up to you.
Well, I have got your biography here, so let me give you a formal, proper introduction that you deserve. So, as a South African composer based in the UK, Rob is senior lecturer in composition at Cardiff University and regularly gives masterclasses and presentations on his work at other institutions in the UK, Ireland, and South Africa. His work explores a range of influences from traditional South African music to 20th and 21st century experimental music via jazz, electronic dance music, and the classical canon, creating a music characterized by twisted cycles, rhythmic energy, and microtonal inflections. The Times has described his work as being fascinating, imaginatively orchestrated, and having its own engaging quirkiness. His music is published by Composer's Edition and Tetractis Publishing, and his debut CD of chamber music, Tracing Lines, is available on the Metier label. The Violin Concerto, An Eventful Morning Near East London, was released in Nimbus in 2017, garnering a range of excellent reviews, BBC Music Magazine describing it as exquisitely crafted and arresting work. His music has also been released on Orchid, Herald, Prima Facie, TUTL and Foundry labels, and broadcast on BBC Radio 3, Australian Broadcasting Corporation Radio, Swedish Radio P2, Portuguese Radio Antenna 2, and various South African radio stations. So now, that gives a bit of background and context then for Rob to introduce now his work. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you very much, Amanda. So yes, hello again, everybody. Amanda's covered some of the key things that I was going to say. So I'm going to really just give you a little introduction to the piece that we'll hear tomorrow night. As Amanda said, I'm from South Africa originally. I studied in Cape Town. I did my undergraduate in Cape Town. I grew up in Cape Town. Was born originally in the Eastern Cape in Port Elizabeth. I moved to the UK in 1999 to do postgraduate studies at the Royal Academy of Music, and then stayed on to do my PhD in Southampton with Michael Finnessy. My sort of musical background is quite varied. I did a lot of singing as a child, and when I left school, I actually sang in an opera chorus for a year, somewhat spuriously, but there you go, I did it. But I trained as a violinist mostly, played the whole range of chamber music, orchestral music, string music, etc., etc. I've also got various experiences working in African traditional music, and have studied jazz and various other things. So I think I just like music. I think that's really my kind of main sort of USP. I like music, and am fascinated by it, and draw as widely as I can. When something resonates, I respond to it, I suppose, compositionally very often. Having been a violinist and also being married to a viola player, and my best friend's a viola player, I have ended up writing a lot of string music, including quite a few string quartets now, a couple of duos. I'm just finishing a duo for violin and cello, some trios. I've written a violin concerto grosso for string trio, etc., etc. So that's been a big feature of my life. And I'm also, as I said before, I've worked quite a bit as a singer, and actually I would say probably my principal interest as a composer is writing opera and song. This is all relevant to what I'm about to say, so hopefully it's vaguely interesting at this stage. When the Villiers Quartet came along and talked to me about the project, I was very excited about this because Diversity is something that I find I think is it's not even important. It's just interesting. It is important, but it's also interesting, and I think kind of the world we live in is a very diverse world. And so I was quite interested to look at this topic in a piece, but particularly because last year and through lockdown, I was spending a lot of my time writing an opera, or finishing, I should say, an opera, and which we then recorded back in November last year. It was released earlier this year as a film. This opera is called Becky Zizwe, and the opera is about immigration, racism, parenthood, and I suppose ultimately something that exercises me a lot is sort of how culture is made, is sort of underlies a lot of what this piece is about. So Becky Zizwe, I was just finishing this up and, like I say, recording it as the Villiers Quartet approached me about this project. And so I wanted to draw on the opera in making this piece for the Villiers Quartet because for a number of reasons. First of all, as I said before, most of lockdown for me was spent either teaching and marking and all those sorts of things that we all had to do online and have had to continue doing online. But also the other very large part of my time of lockdown was spent writing my opera. So I was kind of chained to a desk for the majority of last year, really, when I wasn't out running. Also, obviously, this piece is very fresh in my mind, and there were a couple of things that really kind of stuck in my mind once we'd sort of recorded it. There were bits of music that I felt sort of needed revisiting in some shape or form. And I think the last reason the opera became kind of important to me for this project was because the theme of the project of Becky Zizwe, the opera, is so tightly connected to what the themes of the symposium, but also the project itself, the Full Home project. So the opera kind of chimed in very nicely with these ideas. So what I'm proposed to do, hopefully quickly enough, is to just give a very brief introduction to Becky Zizwe, just to kind of explain, what the piece is. The piece originated probably about 3 years ago when I had been discussing for some time with my friend Jabulo Madlala, who's a South African baritone who won the Kathleen Ferrier Award a few years ago, based in London. We'd been talking about writing a monodrama for him for some time, and a conversation with Michael McCarthy at Music Theatre Wales about solo Korean music, as it happens. So a Korean storytelling tradition had sort of sparked an idea for a piece, which we then went to develop through various funding applications being what drives these things generally. But the sort of starting point for the story of the piece was essentially something biographical about Jabulo. Jabulo's story is quite interesting, but essentially the kind of bare bones are that he was brought up in late apartheid South Africa, moved to the UK to study, and the very broad outlines of this are followed in the story. The sort of starting point of the process then was I sat down in a room with Jabulo and our director Ben Davis, and we basically sat down in a room for 3 days and thrashed out ideas and possibilities and things we wanted to explore in the opera. Once we'd done that, we then I put together a scenario from that, which we then kind of confirmed, and I started working with a wonderful South African librettist, Mkhululi Mabija. And the two of us basically spent the next few years kind of putting this piece together. So it was 3 years in process in the end. The story essentially, I should just give you the blurb really. It's the easy way to do it. It's a monodrama for baritone and 5 instruments. The piece traces the life of this character Becky Zizwe Shange, who's a young South African Zulu man from his childhood during the last years of apartheid in South Africa to studies and fatherhood in the UK in the early 2000s. So really the kind of key themes are obviously identity, race, immigration, parenthood, culture, and it's all explored through the experiences of this character. There are various other characters that the singer plays as well. In the end, Jabulo was unable to be available to perform the piece, so the film was actually made with a wonderful Zambian British baritone Themba Mvula, who is quite extraordinary, and I hope you'll all be hearing. If you haven't heard him already, I hope you'll be hearing him soon. He's quite an extraordinary chap and a lovely guy too, as you'll see in a moment. So that hopefully kind of gives you some sense of why this is relevant to this piece. What I thought I'd do is once I started thinking about the piece. for Villiers Quartet, for the Villiers Quartet for this project. Obviously, the sort of key theme of from home, but also about diversity. Becky sees what kind of comes to the UK is obviously, as I think those of us who are immigrants have experienced, you sort of arrive and you sort of find yourself very much a fish out of water, trying to work out how everything works and how people think and how people communicate and all those sorts of things. Becky sees where being a young Black South African man, obviously, and with a sort of very strong, some pretty traumatic experiences in his past from post-apartheid South Africa, during apartheid, I should say, rather, in his childhood, he comes into it. He experiences some of the various forms of racism, sort of intentional and otherwise, that one experiences. And he then meets a young woman, as a white British woman, Sarah, who actually, they sort of gradually fall in love. And when I was thinking about writing this piece, there's a moment in the opera where an aria where this process of them starting to fall in love happens, and it's a bit like all of the threads of various threads of Becky Zizwe's music sort of start coming together in this aria, and also they sort of start to make kind of a new music, if you see what I mean. So there's this sort of moment where he's trying to find essentially a space for himself in British society, and by kind of meeting Sarah, there's the possibility of this. I mean, it's a bit more complicated than that. Obviously, it's never simple, but it sort of starts opening out those possibilities. So this moment of Becky Zizwe going, okay, so maybe there is a possibility here. Maybe there is a way for me to live in this place and feel at home in some way. What I'm going to do, I'm going to play you a little bit of that aria because it is entirely the basis on which I've written the Villiers Quartet piece, so it sort of seems relevant. Just give me a moment to set up a screen share. Hopefully you can all see that with a bit of luck. And I will just hit play. If anybody's having any problems hearing or anything like that, please do give me a wave and tell me if there are any issues, but hopefully that is clear enough. Can you see an image there on the screen of a young man kneeling down? Okay. All right, here we go.
Staring back, Sarah, a voice, siren song so clear, Sarah, her hair, golden corn flowing free, Sarah, her skin so white, so precious, Sarah.
Okay, I'll stop there. That gives you enough of the piece to understand a little bit about the piece I've written for Villiers, which is really what we're talking about. So what I've done, like I say, the idea with this piece, with this aria, is the sort of key idea here is, like I say, him sort of starting to find a place or a space in which he might be able to exist in British society. It's much, as I say, it's much more complex than that. Her father turns out to be a rather unpleasant character. Etc. etc. I won't go into that. What I've tried to do with this piece is I've taken the various materials that you can hear there. And you might have noticed there this aria and two or three other movements that are which represent similar moments, developments of this moment, where they actually get together officially. Here he's still kind of just thinking a bit about her. But this ground bass essentially underlies all of his the sort of love music, I suppose, for Sarah. And so I've taken the ground bass that you hear there, and I've taken also, maybe I'll show you the score for this. Just give me a moment to second. 1 minute. Maybe I'll show you the score, the original score. Just there. So, can you see that? No. Can you see that at the moment? The score of the piece there? It should be showing. Give me a second. I'll try again. Can you see the score? Just give me a thumbs up if you.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So there you can see the ground bass part here is in the viola. The rising line, the four note step goes another 4 steps, another 4 steps, another 4 steps, and then a 5th phrase. So basically it's a 5/4 note phrases, which then repeats there and then repeats one more time. When I stop the recording a moment ago, that's where it sort of repeats one more time. So that is one of the materials that is on which the Berlioz Quartet piece is based. This sort of decorated melodic line that you see sort of gradually becomes more and more busy. That's a secondary material that I've taken for the Berlioz Quartet. This pizzicato part over here in the viola, that also is another little piece of material that's used. And then I think that's about, and then of course the melody, the vocal melody, sorry, I'm scrolling around madly here. The vocal melody over here, that's also used. So essentially what I'm trying to do with the Berlioz Quartet piece is to take the initial, that sort of aria, or sort of a version of that aria, and start with each of these pieces of material in almost kind of primordial form. So if you look, for example, I'll show you the score of that we've got here. So, and you'll hopefully kind of get a sense of this straight away. So again, looking at that, if you look at the opening of the score, you'll see in the first violin, we've got the C, D sharp, E, F sharp, which is the sort of opening, well, it's actually not, it's the 3rd or 4th phrase of the original kind of Cantus Firmus line, but it's sort of exploded into a much longer version, very, very slowly. And also it's very, very much high in the register. So I've sort of taken that kind of Cantus Firmus and gradually sort of revealed it across the course of the piece. So there's what I'm trying to do, I suppose, with the piece is to take those materials and kind of reenact what I've done in the opera, but in a completely different way. So we get a completely different piece of music where these various materials that are part of the aria are gradually they start from this kind of, like, say, primordial state where they're just little kind of fidgets that you maybe saw in the score. There's a little semitone moving very fast, a little kind of figure like that, which gradually actually opens out into the melody that we hear later on in the aria. So I'm sort of trying to, this sort of image of spinning weaving, which is the name of the piece, is that I'm sort of taking each of these kind of tiny little pieces of material and gradually sort of spinning them into a melodic or some sort of rhythmic thread, and then taking all of those, the 4 threads that I spin in that way, and weaving them together into this little sort of aria texture that eventually emerges. I suppose structurally it's a little bit like the Dowland, the Britain Lacrymae, where you sort of start off with the piece which is quite sparse, and essentially kind of gradually move through to the piece where you actually reveal the sort of melody at the end. Well, not quite at the end, something else happens after that. But the process is, like I say, very much about emerging and becoming, I suppose, which is something I find very interesting, sort of idea of I suppose in terms of culture, but in terms of personalities and people, how things kind of gradually weave together and become something and then sort of break apart and kind of become other things. There's this kind of constant sense of we're always kind of going, my feeling is we're sort of always going through a process of becoming. And I think my understanding of culture, I suppose, in a similar sort of way, that we're always kind of going through a process of identifying what's interesting, working with that, dropping it when it becomes less interesting, bringing in other ideas, and everything is constantly evolving, which is interesting and quite challenging and terrifying at times too as well. But something that I find very fascinating and something that I find happening quite a lot in my work. Hopefully that's given you a bit of introduction to the piece, maybe more than you were hoping for. So apologies for that. But hopefully it is interesting, and hopefully it raised some questions which we can discuss as we go along. So thank you very much. Back to you, Amanda.
Great, thanks, Rob. That's really comprehensive. So very insightful. So perhaps this would be a good time to address some of the questions that have so far arisen. I know I've noticed that, Florrie, you've already sort of responded to Alex's in the Q&A, but I thought it might be useful to perhaps talk a bit about that, because Alexander Douglas puts a question in asking about your process. He said, I'd be fascinated to understand how you argue for the influence of Makam on your decision-making, and how you understand tonality as something to both embrace and resist. Also, you're playing percussion, teaching piano and conducting, and I'm also curious to know to what extent jazz is part of your identity and what you mean by this word. So there's quite a lot in that question. And I know you've already sort of addressed it in the Q&A, but I just thought it'd be a good opportunity for you to respond.
Yeah, it's kind of 6 or 7 questions in one, really, isn't it? So yeah, what was it? Arguing for the inclusion of Makam or something? How did Alexander phrase it?
Arguing for the influence of Makam.
Yeah.
Making.
So yeah, I don't know exactly. You know, I don't have any kind of Arabic or Middle Eastern heritage at all. So, but I'm not really engaged in some sort of cultural appropriation here. I'm not trying to imitate anything stylistically about Arabic or North African music. I'm not writing a pastiche of that style. I think really what I wanted to express when I was speaking about it earlier is that what I've taken from this sort of compositional system is the idea of organizing pitch based on melodic shape rather than the kind of tonal hierarchy that we have in sort of traditional Western classical music. It's a different approach to pitch organization. So that's really what I've taken from it, some sort of tuning system. So I don't think my music, the results, we listen to, it doesn't sound particularly Middle Eastern, but maybe there's like a little hint of that flavor in there. I don't know, maybe it's like cooking with cumin without actually cooking an Indian curry.
That's a good analogy, isn't it?
That makes sense.
Yeah. Yes, because I wouldn't have thought of it as being Arabic, in fact, had I not seen what you'd said about it. So
yeah. And there's something about jazz as well. I mean, I think it's just really recognition of like, I play a lot of jazz music. Not at the moment. No one's playing a lot of any sort of music like recently. But I've been playing jazz music for a very long time. I was in National Youth Jazz Orchestra as a kid, clarinet, saxophone, as a drummer, and mostly as a pianist. I've done a lot of jazz arranging. I ran a very successful student jazz orchestra for a number of years. I'm just kind of immersed in jazz as performance. So some of that sort of jazz vernacular has become part of my compositional language, sort of accidentally. I mean, I'm not writing jazz music, but again, there's a lot of things that I kind of do instinctively, like when I'm constructing harmonies or thinking rhythmically, or if I go to the piano to try stuff out, my hands naturally fall into sort of certain voicings and so on. Yeah, maybe it's something I consciously resist. It's like, oh no, this is about sounding jazzy again, and sometimes it's something I embrace, but it is part of like my compositional makeup. It's the music I play a lot, and it's become part of the music I write, I suppose.
Great, thanks, Florrie. And there's a question also for Alex, and I think we'll probably take this question and then have a short comfort break before we then continue for the next hour. So Alex, there's a question here from Joanna Bullivant. She says, she's interested in your use of silence, which was also a striking feature of Philip's piece last night. Could you say any more about this? Is this exploring ideas of speaking / being silenced?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think the response to this probably overlaps a little bit with Alexander Douglas's second half of the question, so perhaps I can link into that as well. And thank you for that question, Joe. Yeah, I really I love silence, or like the idea of silence more like, and it's something which I am beginning to learn about more and more in terms of its cultural significance in kind of East Asian philosophy, which is something I'm not well versed in at all, but a lot of members, well, several members of Tangram are, and so have been educating me in the last month or so. But I think for me, like silence is very much alive, and I think there are a lot of different kinds of silences. So hopefully, in Chinese whispers, it didn't feel like the piece had necessarily ended before it had ended, because I think we have this like very common rhetoric in Western classical music where silence equals death. You see it so much in different kind of musical narratives in opera and the like. But I guess I don't necessarily perceive silence like that. And I guess as John Cage has tried to show, silence ultimately doesn't exist. But I think the link then to Alexander Douglas's question is, so just to read out a little bit of it, it was, how do you approach post-tonal theory and the ongoing challenges of assumption about music and language, blah, blah, blah. And I guess particularly about the post-tonal theory stuff, which is, I mean, even those three words put together is such a Western classical music thing. And I think something which I'm aware of that I am trying to do constantly with myself is basically to kind of decolonize myself and my own assumptions and my kind of Western musical and cultural education. And so post-tonal theory is something I haven't like thought about actively for a very, very long time, probably not since undergrad. But I think, however, having said that, the offshot is that what I have been doing is thinking about deprioritizing harmony and deprioritizing pitch. So particularly in Chinese whispers, I wasn't really thinking about a pitch structure, which, you know, my composition teacher also would have been like shocked by, maybe not. I wasn't thinking about that at all. I was thinking about timbre, I was thinking about gesture, and I was thinking about rhythm, which are elements that are hugely important in a load of different musics, which just aren't Western classical musics. And so perhaps there's a link there also with silence, which does play quite a big role in several pieces I've written, and I think there's perhaps a kind of subconscious element or a subconscious connection there, whereby like I don't see silence necessarily as the kind of death character, but as something very much alive and something which breathes life into sound.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alex. That's really lovely to hear. And I think we'll come back to these points. So at this point, for the wider audience, just to encourage you to continue to add more questions into the chat, and we'll revisit them in the second hour of this session. So we'll take a 5-minute break now and continue the discussion. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our roundtable discussion with composers Florrie Maunders, Alex Ho, and Rob Fokkens. I thought we might continue the discussion with a question that was actually posed in the chat by Joanna Bolivant, but directed initially at Florrie, but actually I'd like to open it up to Alex and Rob as well. Because she says, Florrie mentioned being rooted in sound as a composer, and the string quartet tends to be thought of as an abstract genre. Against that, Rob and Alex made such important points about colonial history and how we don't talk enough about it in education, or I would say in British music studies. how do you explore this tension of sonic or abstract and social in your string quartets, or do you think it's even possible? So Florrie, perhaps you would like to answer that first and then have responses perhaps from Alex and Rob.
Sure, yeah, it's a great question, isn't it? Because the string quartet is probably like the most classical ensemble. It's kind of like, I don't know, it's more classical than the symphony orchestra in some regard. It's classical music taken into people's homes. It's this symbol of sort of upper class, white, middle European prestige and power or something, isn't it? And there's something about the whole history of string quartets as being, you know, and chamber music in general as being like a leisure time activity for the wealthy as well. So in the sort of pre-recorded music era, the idea of people just having that leisure time and money to be able to afford just to spend time playing musical instruments for their own entertainment. And we're kind of getting back towards that in our society in maybe the last 50 years or so, that actually, you know, music as a leisure time activity is something that is accessible to all. But, you know, historically, it was something that's either practiced by professionals or only by the very, very wealthy. And that's kind of the interesting thing about writing a string quartet. It comes with this association of sort of 16th, 17th century aristocracies, this baggage that comes with it. But also it has its roots in amateur music making as well, and dialogue, and you know, it doesn't have that top-down direction you get with a conducted orchestra. You know, when we see a string quartet playing together, there's very often sort of meeting of equals and something like that. So it comes with all these really interesting constructs. But also, it's very enduring form. I mean, one of the great things I think about the string quartet is that it just really works as a musical group. We have these four very similar voiced instruments, and they cover all the things that we seem to crave in our music. You know, the different pitch areas. There's kind of a good number of musicians working together. If you look at kind of other sort of popular ensembles, I suppose like the so from the 1950s onwards, the popular music equivalent to the string quartet is the sort of standard rock combos with sort of bass guitar, rhythm guitar, lead guitar, vocalist, drums. You know, it's almost like a standard lineup in the same way the string quartet is. And that kind of shared language and shared ensemble is really, really, really useful for composers and audiences, because setting up expectations and then working within them is a kind of shortcut to communication. I mean, all of our spoken and written languages are based on shared sounds and experiences. And it can be quite difficult for a composer to communicate if they have to make a new language for every piece, and then the audience don't understand the words they're saying. So starting from that shared experience of a string quartet is very good in many ways. I guess what I'm really trying to say is that it does come with all this baggage, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. I wonder what Alex and Robert have to say about that.
Thanks, Alex. That's very kind. I mean, I think it's a very interesting question, because Tom Hyde, who I think is here in the room with us this afternoon, is we were at the Royal Academy together. So Tom's known me since I first came to the UK, and we did our masters together. This is relevant, by the way, just in case you're wondering. Tom, I will never forget when in my first year at the Academy, Tom saying to me something along the lines of, oh yes, writing a string quartet is so hard because there's this deep weight of history. Tom, I may be misattributing this to you. Forgive me if I am. But I do remember very vividly having a moment, at least, where somebody, and I'm pretty sure it was Tom, saying, you know, oh, there's this great history of the string quartet. Isn't it hard to write a string quartet? And I just looked at him and I thought, I've never ever considered that in any way, and maybe that's because I'm a string player. But it was at that point in my life, it was something, and in fact still today, I don't really think very hard about the tradition when I'm composing. It comes out because I play the instrument, and I'm sure, and there are undoubtedly things about European string music which are deeply ingrained in my musical history. And sorry, Tom. Yes, indeed. It's there, and it's part of the heritage that I bring when I'm creating. But I really think if one is going to give things weight, they will take weight. So if you approach something simply as a group of 4 instruments, that yes has a very rich and fascinating history, but also a group of instruments that can do many different extraordinary things. You can approach it in a way that, I suppose, in a way, decenters the sort of tradition that it carries and says, well, actually, there are other things this ensemble can do. I mean, someone like Justinian Tamassuza, for example, his string quartet is an extraordinary piece and sort of really just works with Ugandan music. Quite what's the word, uncompromisingly, but not because he was trying to be uncompromising, but because that was the music he wanted to make with the ensemble. And so this, and I guess Kevin Volans is another composer who has done very much the same thing, where you've simply gone, well, here's a group of 4 instruments, what sort of sounds can it make? And I guess this is what I was saying earlier about how I understand creativity. Certainly musical creativity is about sort of drawing on your traditions and the things that interest you and the things that engage you and inspire you, and sort of making culture anew in each piece you write in a way. And that might be, for each of us, it may be something that you do, I mean, I tend to do the same thing over and over again. So, but in doing so, I'm trying to kind of make a voice for myself, if you see what I mean. And that voice, yes, it carries historical resonances. Yes, it carries all sorts of resonances. But ultimately, it's sort of me at a sort of nodal point in history going, this is what I'm interested in doing. This is what excites me. I'm going to write this piece. And I think if we approach the quartet rather than as this sort of venerable institution, and instead treat it as 4 instruments that we can use to our own ends, being conscious of the traditions, but also maybe not even being conscious of all the traditions, I think you find the results quite fascinating. And we go back, for example, to the Soweto String Quartet in South Africa, who, I mean, those sort of, who sort of did a lot of kind of, fairly standard classical repertoire, but also did a lot of kwela and jive and various arrangements of traditional South African musics and popular South African musics. Or, for example, Buscade in Soweto, the big sort of strings project there, if you take ownership of the thing, you can do things with it and you can make culture afresh. If you allow it to dominate you, then then it will. And so that, I mean, I guess that's really my approach, is to kind of look at something like that and go, well, this is a great set of instruments. They make good sounds. What can I do with that is interesting, that is about now, that is about me and my interests? And I think, again, so just trying to take, as a creator, trying to take the power of the situation, whoever you are and wherever you come from, and say, well, I have the space to do what I want to do here because I am making new, and that, I think, is how we move forward, but I'm in no way arguing that we should all stop listening to Haydn and Beethoven. This is great music, it's good music, it's amazing music that does extraordinary things with an ensemble that, I mean, if you think about Haydn, that had only just been invented, really, and they were doing the same thing. They were going, hey, here's 4 really cool instruments. What can we do with them? What sort of textures can this do? And I think if you approach it with that sort of sense of, well, these instruments are interesting, and they, yes, they have a baggage, but they also have a whole lot of potential that needs to be explored, and they can be turned to all sorts of things. If you think of the Turtle Island Quartet, you think about the range of composers who've written quartets influenced by music from everywhere. Like I say, think about Buscade or the Soweto String Quartet turning it to traditional kwela and well, not traditional kwela, but those sorts of things. I just think as a creator, that is the joy that we live in, and it can be stressful and it can be complex and weird, and we are all interstitial, we are all liminal, and I think particularly people who have come from other places and live in new places, you are liminal, you are between things, but that's exciting. it's positive, I think, and sort of using that to create is I guess what I try to do more than anything else. Sorry, I'll stop now. Hopefully that's useful.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, that's great and really useful, and ideas about how to take culture forward in the ways you suggest. Yeah, and which I feel that Alex was sort of doing as well. And did you have a response to make, Alex, to that question?
Yeah, definitely. Such an interesting discussion already, and I really love what you're saying, Rob, about pointing out that we are located in the interstices, and that is quite a common kind of rhetoric of post-colonial discourse as well, like understanding that identity is in flux and that it is dynamic and it's not a kind of static category, which I totally agree with. I think on the other hand, I probably have a slightly different approach, which may regardless like result in a similar outcome somehow, but just in terms of the historical baggage that the string quartet comes with, and I know this was kind of drawn upon yesterday in Laura Tunbridge's really amazing keynote about like kind of the string quartet as civilizing, which feels like quite a kind of colonial term. But I guess for me, like I think because of my background, like being brought up in London, a very like Western and white education, I feel that I cannot ignore the baggage that comes with writing a string quartet. But then ironically, that kind of means that I feel the urge to perhaps do what Rob was just talking about, to remake culture afresh. And there are loads of different ways to do this, but I do think that for me, like I can't unsee, if that makes sense. Like I can't unsee the kind of colonial structures, like in classical music, in opera, in choral music. Now I'm just like throwing everything under the bus, but yeah, bear with me. And so I guess it's something which I try to do in quite a lot of my music, which is to look at these structures and see what I can do, see what little I can do to try and engage with this kind of thing. So I guess to respond to Joanna's kind of provocation, like how do you explore the tension between like the sonic / abstract and social in your string quartets or music perhaps more broadly? For me, like I cannot see music as abstract. I don't see it as autonomous, and I see that as quite a colonial way of thinking. The idea that it is separated from society or cultures or identities and hierarchies and that kind of thing. And so I think it is important, I guess, again, like to be talking about these things, and even things like the title of a piece or like the program note of a piece, I think goes a long way in potentially shaping how we think about music. So again, just thinking about the non-sonic ways in which we present music is classical music, is super important.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, I can see some more questions here for you, Rob, angled at you. So perhaps we should address, there's one from William Forey. That's how you pronounce it. He says, I love this idea of weaving, which I guess has also been a larger theme in South African string quartet music, especially Voland's and Blake's string quartets. He says, I'm also wondering about the moments of rupture, the moments when we perhaps sense the tensions between the string quartet as a medium with a certain kind of colonial history and the indigenous South African musics that were erased under the colonial apartheid regimes. Have you thought about these tensions? And if so, how do you deal with them in your compositional practice? Strikes me this discussion is perhaps more readily happening in opera, but do you think it's something to consider with string quartets too?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in a way I've kind of answered William's question. Nice to hear from you, William. Good that you're here. I suppose my feeling, and a bit, I think Alex's point is a good one. I'm in no way arguing that music is separated, and again, I don't really think of music as being something kind of separate from society. And when I talk about making culture afresh, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not talking just about making new music. I mean that by making your music and speaking your voice, and finding and trying to develop a voice, you are working in culture. You are making culture in the wider sense, in the social sense, in as much as you're making it musically. You are trying to change the conversation, I suppose. So, but one does that within music because one is a musician. And I've chosen not to be a politician or any of those, or a writer about music or a writer about anything, because I find I can speak most happily through music. So that is what I choose to do. But that doesn't mean it's never intended as. It is, I guess, I sort of always go back to what Michael Findessy said to me when I was studying that, everything you do is political with a small p. And I suppose that is essentially kind of where I stand with this, that, I might write a piece that is, an abstract piece of concert music, but in centering certain types of voices through my interests, I would like to think that has some sort of bearing on a broader, longer cultural conversation, I suppose. In terms of the sort of weight of history again, and sort of the weight of the instruments and the forum, I think these are things that we have to think about. We have to kind of consider them to a certain degree, but again, I think as a creator, I'm more concerned with making, I think, and I'm sort of making and understanding the context I'm making in, trying to draw on things that interest me, and simply trying to kind of move forward from that, I suppose. I don't really know what more one can do as a composer. One can be conscious, and one is conscious because one is where one is. We are all in the space that we're in, and if we are considered about what we do, we know what that means. So I think one of the things I do think about quite a lot is, where music happens, for example, and what sort of context it's performed in. And I'm still, if I'm concerned about, what I do, it's about the fact that a lot of what I do happens in spaces that are perhaps, not really, that are quite sort of traditional in a way. And I'd be quite excited really to, I'm sort of excited by why I mentioned things like Buscade or Soweto String Quartet, or, kids who are learning violin in the townships, is that there is, that in those contexts where you're making, where you give somebody an instrument, or you teach somebody a language, and they then run with it freely, and make something fresh out of that intersection. That for me is the sort of exciting thing about it. And I think as a creator, being exercised by the history is important, but it's more important that I'm thinking forward. I guess that my approach has always just been kind of go, okay, well, how do we change the conversation by doing, I suppose, rather than saying, well, there is all this history, let's, maybe you can reenact that in the music, or you can, William asks about rupture. I spent a lot of time writing music, and I still occasionally do, where I would set something up and then literally kind of squash it dead for exactly that reason, to kind of go, well, actually, this is all about rupture. It's about kind of taking two things and trying to smash them together, and or sort of looking at cultures and kind of interacting them in ways that are violent and disruptive. So, I've even written a piece called On Disruption and Displacement when I was doing my PhD back in 2005. So that sort of theme is, I think, quite deeply embedded in what I do. But again, I've sort of moved past that. I'm more interested. I do interrupt myself quite often, as you can tell when I'm speaking, but I certainly do it musically as well. But now I'm kind of more interested in a way of how things can sort of feed each other, maybe a bit more organically, in some instances. And other instances, the opera kind of there's a lot of rupture going on in that as well. So yeah, I'm not really answering any questions here. I'm sort of throwing some thoughts around, but hopefully that gives some sense of at least of how I think about it. I do think for myself, the most important thing for me is that as a creator, I take what I know and what interests me, and through making what I make, hopefully change the cultural conversation in some small way. And normally is quite small given what we do as contemporary composers, but it's often small, important ways that maybe have bigger implications in the long term, hopefully.
Thanks, Rob. That leads to some interesting ideas around sort of away from exclusivity, I suppose, but also I'm thinking of the later part of Alex's question in the last comment about how you would respond to the idea that a composer continues the process of their own becoming, self-realization, through the action or praxis of composing. That would apply to all of you, I suppose. And then he says, how does that play out for you as a white South African telling a story that moves into and beyond the territory of jungle fever?
Well, absolutely. I think that is sort of fundamentally what I feel I am doing when I'm composing. Is I'm sort of, you're kind of making yourself constantly and remaking yourself constantly. There are things that are important to you at certain moments that you draw on. Other times you're drawing on other things. There are sort of certain core things that are constant. But I do. That is genuinely how I think about composing. Is that you're constantly sort of examining who you are, where you've come from, what the background all is. But you're doing it through music, and you're sort of focusing on using the sparks, the dissonant sparks, the consonant sparks. All of the sort of richness of who we are. You're using that to kind of create energy and sort of and then put that on the page, hopefully to communicate to your players. So I might have misunderstood Alex. There's quite Alexander Douglas. Sorry, not Alex. I might have misunderstood the question, but I think you put things out there because there is some compulsion to do so. As a white South African, that it's just quite a strange, complex space, and it's never a comfortable space. But that in a way, I guess, is what is interesting about it again, because I suppose maybe hopefully what's coming across from what I'm saying is that uncomfortable spaces are part of life. I've been very privileged. I've been very lucky in my life, so I've no grounds for complaint. But if you think about where you come from and what your experiences are, and what the people around you are experiencing, all that sort of thing, you will find there are lots of tensions and difficulties, and if you sort of focus in on those, they become problems. If you use them to kind of bounce off each other and sort of stimulate creative energy, I think it can be very, very valuable and very powerful. And I guess that's what composers and creative people do. You draw on your pain or your experience, let's put it that way, and create something from that. So yeah, that constant sense of making is absolutely part of it. In terms of reception, I've come to the view that reception is something composers should not really concern themselves with, simply because you have no idea how people are going to respond to your music. And you simply can't control or manage that in any way. You can put things out there, you can try and sort of put it in the context that you hope is the right sort of thing. You can try and make a program note that explains what people are supposed to think, and even with all of that, people still misread you in exciting, creative, fun ways. And again, that's part of the creative process. And that is just part of being creative. You have to accept and enjoy that, I suppose.
Florrie, yes, if you've got something to add there.
Yeah, it's really interesting to ask these kind of questions about, how people's influences and backgrounds affect their music making. There is a bit of a tendency, maybe in the new music world, for composers to write sermons, if that makes sense. So there's music with a message, music with a meaning, and also people writing, what's the word for it? Something like trauma pornography or something like that. So, this music about how tough and terrible my life is, or these other people's lives. There's extra musical additions that can be put onto the music. So, as I sort of mentioned before, my approach is very much around the sound and what the music sounds like, and the creation of sounds, manipulation of sounds. So it's really kind of like the core of the compositional craft. And yeah, music can, suggest different cultures and movements and historical events and strong emotions and so on. And as a composer, I think probably, speaking for myself, but for many other composers as well, the music that we write is very much influenced by ourselves and our own lives and the situations that we find ourselves in. But it's very much, I think, a sort of classic FM phenomenon, isn't it, of like getting obsessed with the biographies of composers rather than the music they're writing. Everyone talks about Beethoven and they can't help but mention like his deafness or something, or writing about Tchaikovsky, he had this terrible repressed homosexuality or something. And it's kind of easier for maybe people to engage with that than to engage with the music, because I'm not sure that the general British music listening public is very sort of musically literate. And by that, I mean, they don't really know how to talk about music. Very often in the conversations we have about music, we talk about musicians. or we talk about our own personal responses. So, rather than people talking about the music, they're talking about other people, which is kind of really interesting sidetrack. But a lot of these questions coming in here are kind of, rather than being about music, seem to be about people, which is maybe a symptom of this thing we keep seeing. I don't know if anyone else has some thoughts about how music discussions keeps seeming to be about musicians rather than music.
Well, actually, this ties in with a question that I haven't ignored, but I've been trying to work out the best place to put it, which was from Ron Tendler right at the beginning, which asked, is music about one's subjective feelings and technical ideas appealing to individuals with similar ideas, or should it reflect real life feeling that is based on objective reality that unites humanity?
I think you're going to struggle to unite humanity on that level. I think one of the big, what I was saying a moment ago. Sorry, I've sort of leapt in here. Sorry, guys. If anybody else wants to answer, feel free to shut up. Yeah. I think the great myth of the universality of music is one of the great, I think, colonial, frankly, lies. Where well, everybody likes Bach, so it must be universal. I think everybody could like Bach. A lot of people have never heard of Bach, and so it's almost entirely an irrelevant kind of thought in a way. So I think music can draw people together. It can, you can make a communal experience with music very powerfully. But there's always somebody who disagrees. There's always somebody in a room, in any room of listeners, in any audience. There will be some people who love what you're doing and some people who really hate what you're doing and a whole lot of people who are fast asleep and a few people who don't really care. That's just the nature of music in a way, and it's the nature of being. And I suppose, if you manage in a particular moment in time and in a particular place to do something that somehow chimes with that moment very powerfully, then you will draw more people into that than you might do if you are sort of bashing on about something in your work that you think is fascinating but nobody else has recognized yet, or maybe nobody ever will recognize. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I think the sort of idea that we can kind of draw the world together through music is lovely and marvelous and beautiful, but completely nonsensical. I think there's more chance now than there ever has been because of this kind of global popular culture, particularly. But it's certainly, it's not really a realistic thing to be thinking about. Forgive me if I've misrepresented or misunderstood your question, Ron, I think it was. But I do think it's very, very important to be, from my perspective, to kind of put that marker down and say, we make where we are now, we listen where we are now. And yes, we can all listen to the most extraordinary amount of music. We could start listening today and listen constantly until we die, and we probably wouldn't even cover about 0.1% of the music that there is in the world. So it's not universal, but you can enjoy music. If you have open ears, you can engage with things in certain ways quite positively. But you can't expect everybody to engage with music in the same way. And I think that's the fundamental thing. Everyone's engaging in such different ways. And it means so many different things to everybody. You have to sort of be conscious of that. And I think as a creator, again, you put it out there and say, this is something I think, or something I have thought, or something I'm busy thinking. And then you just sort of hope for the best, I suppose, really, that it chimes with somebody somewhere, in some way, whether the way you intended or not.
So this leads towards how then, that as a composer, you sort of address the ideas around exclusivity in relation to classical music, since that's the genre you're writing within in this context, and what approaches you have to make that more accessible. And I suppose if you take it in educational context as well, what would your sort of advice be to composers, younger composers, an 18-year-old trying to set out in the world, how would they approach composition? So I'm just thinking about how we can open up this question to talk more about exclusivity in relation to classical music.
Well, I'm not sure about... sorry.
No, you go for it.
I was going to say, I'm not sure about Alex and Robert, but I don't really see myself as writing classical music. Classical music's something that happened. It's done. I write music. I'm a composer. I think in 2021, we are in such a musically pluralistic age that there's no real musical mainstream anymore. Everything is splintered and fractured. I mean, even in the world of popular music as well, there is no musical mainstream. So I think this term classical composer or writing classical music is really unhelpful for me. So I'd just say I'm a composer, I write music, and it sounds like the music I write. I don't know.
That's interesting.
Alex, are you going to say something similar?
I think that, yeah, there's definitely overlap. Just quickly to respond to what Rob was just saying, I totally agree about like the myth of music's universality is a totally like colonial phenomenon. I think it applies to the idea of English being the universal language as well, like utterly like colonial. And I guess like one other thread to draw in here is that I think a broader question that is coming out a little bit here is the idea of like who are we writing for as composers or as creators, which, as Rob rightly says, like we have very little control over. So before when I was talking about like titling a piece or program noting a piece, that's just like ways in which I try to engage the audience, but obviously I have no control and have to be at peace with that. And I guess it's kind of similar to what the kind of Polish composer Lusosławski wrote about, I guess decades ago now, but he talked about the idea of composing as soul fishing, which was a way of saying that he writes music for the listener, but acknowledges that the listener is himself. And so his hope is that in some way his music can resonate with other people, kind of like this image of fishing for souls. And so you might not get anyone who engages with your music at all, but equally you might do. And so I guess that releasing of control is really important to acknowledge. But then I guess in terms of the question about composing and mainstream and that kind of thing, for me, like the language is super important. Not just like that broad level of like what language are we speaking in and the kind of implications and assumptions there, but like what words are we using to describe things. And so, for instance, the idea of composing it is totally like a Western classical music thing. Equally, when we talk about music, it's used in higher education so often, but really what it refers to is Western classical music. So my own undergrad, and I know there has been a lot of change and discussion about this internally, and a lot of changes have been made, but at least when I was studying undergrad, I was doing a degree in music, which 90% of which was Western classical music by dead white males. An analysis course that literally only did like string quartets by Schubert, Beethoven, Bach, didn't go anything beyond I don't know, probably 1830 maybe, Beethoven 8 string quartets, that kind of thing. So I think I just want to raise the idea that like the specific language and the specific words that we use are so tied to social and kind of political with a small p context.
Yeah, it's interesting because like 90% of the country, if you spoke to them about music, would not assume you were talking about classical music, would they, Alex? They'd be thinking you're talking about popular music, what you'd hear on the radio, or dance music. Really, the kind of music we're talking about today is such a niche endeavor, isn't it?
I mean, Amanda, to answer your question about advice to young composers, which I spend, I suppose, quite a lot of time giving or trying to give helpfully. I think the question fundamentally would sort of start from the point of, are you hoping to make a living as a composer? And if you are, then you have to make some pretty hard choices, I think, because then you are concerned with the marketplace and how do you build a community, whether starting from yourself and building the community from there, which is the hard way to do it, but probably in the long term, the more profitable way to do it. I guess that's what you might say. Something like Philip Glass, Steve Reich did. They sort of went, we want to do this. And there were enough people to go with them that became a sort of an industry, I suppose. So that's one way to do it, or the other way is to kind of, I suppose, join something that's already going. So whether that's writing for films or writing for video games or TV, or any sort of commercial work, or if it's deciding that, well, I don't want to do any of the commercial work, but I want to write a particular type of contemporary music that I know already has some sort of profit to it. So maybe that's writing choral music in the style of Eric Whitacre or Carl Jenkins, or that's an extreme point. I mean, there are all sorts of points along this. We're always talking about spectra rather than there's this and this and nothing else. So if a young composer is saying, this is what I want to do, I want to make a living out of it, there are various ways of doing it, but fundamentally you do have to kind of consider quite carefully how you do that if you want to be doing the things that we've been talking about today, which is to talk about to try to kind of put yourself into the world and go, this is what, this is where I am right now. This is what my, these are my thoughts. This is how I want to contribute to culture. You have to kind of approach it with a slightly different view, I suppose. So that kind of puts us into that very sort of odd space, which I think, I would probably say about sort of 70 or 80% of composers in history have lived in this sort of strange space where they are making their living doing other things, really. And the lucky few, perhaps, maybe they've maybe started from one of those 2 points I've had there. But I think if we're talking just about being creative and being a composer in the sense that you are trying to work yourself out through your music, or you're trying to do something that is personal and unique to you, you do have to kind of leave worries about who's going to say what about your music to one side. For all the reasons I've already said, and even if you take one of those routes that we were talking about before, people are going to say what they say about your music, and you kind of have to just live with that. It's just how it is. So I think so if a composer comes to me and says, I want to be a composer, what do I do? The first thing for me is gradually trying to help a composer work out who they are, what their musical interests are, what their cultural interests are, what their background is, who they are as people, and what stimulates them, and trying to help them sort of find a space where the music they're making responds to that in some way. And of course, you can be more hardcore about that or less hardcore about that. You can be very sort of route one and say, I'm going to write in this style. And I've got an old friend who only ever wrote pieces that were sort of fortissimo minims. That was his style, and was always dissonant and very dissonant at that. And he just said, this is what I do, and I'm not trying to make a living out of this because I know it's not going to work, but that's simply the music that I'm going to write. And sort of fundamentally, I think that's a good position to be starting from if you're genuinely just trying to be creative, if you're just thinking in terms of music as a creative act. But yes, once we get into questions of income and building a community, or building a what's sort of for sort of a commercial sort of income for yourself out of your composing, the questions do become slightly compromised, I suppose. I mean, it's a fairly obvious answer, but yeah, that I think it's an important consideration, basically.
Thanks, yeah, and I thought actually Joanna's comment in her in the chat here about the school composers in the project having never studied notation but were able to express themselves and get ideas on paper. I thought that seems to be really interesting, and goes back, I think, Florrie, to what you were saying about the importance of listening and how that's affected and inspired you and your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, hugely central to my music making is listening, but also Joanna's mentioned notation there as well. I mean, we're talking about music as a universal language, and maybe music isn't a universal language, but the ability to listen is. Maybe when, if using this language metaphor, people are speaking different words, but we can listen to people speaking in other languages, and we can understand something not of what they're saying, but from tones of voice and gesture, we can still take on meaning. And there's a lot of this in music as well. We can listen to some music that we don't understand, but it's not part of our culture. It's coming from a completely different place, but we can still take on emotional and sort of I'm not quite sure we could have a response to it without understanding it, which is maybe how we can view music as this universal language. And of course, musical notation is this amazingly flexible tool. I mean, it's not a fixed thing. People are always adding to it, and there's a lot we can do with notation. I mean, I teach a lot of composition, and really what most of my teaching is listening and notation. I mean, it's very, very central skills, I think, for musicians who want their music to be played by other people. It's that language thing, it's that communication thing. I mean, if you don't use notation and you want your music to be performed by other musicians, then how are you going to give your instructions? Written instructions, verbal instructions are great, but the notation is a shorthand to getting the idea of the sounds you can hear in your head into other people's bows and fingers and reeds and strings and things. And it's really like reading and writing, I suppose. If you want to be an author, but you don't have any literacy skills, sure, you can tell stories, but it's going to be very, very hard to publish a novel. You're going to have to dictate it to somebody else who then writes it down and puts it into this format that everybody can understand and digest. I mean, it's kind of it's popular at the moment to knock notation and say it's not useful, and say, oh no, there's no use of notation in rock music or drum and bass music or whatever. And that's because drum and bass music is being produced by one person very often, like on their own computer. They don't need to notate it because they're not passing on the information to somebody else. It's direct communication. You know, the performer is the computer that the producer, composer, songwriter is working on themselves. I mean, sure, this music could be notated, but there's no need for it in that situation because they themselves are the performer. And there's the same with, you know, most pop and rock music. Again, the performers are very often the same people who are writing the music. In that case, you don't need notation. But if we want to have this kind of art music culture and where we have somebody who is a composer and their role is creating music for other people to play, then there's no getting around the fact that they need to communicate that idea with their performers in some way.
Yes, well, I suppose
I'll get off my soapbox now.
Yeah. Yeah, so the whole point of the communication aspect, whether or not you call it art music, but if you want somebody else to repeat that performance or to repeat that music, then there has to be a way of doing that, doesn't there? So Alex.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thanks, Florrie. Alex, you had a question?
Yeah, I guess this is probably tying in what Stevie has put into the chat here, which is really interesting. Also about notation and talking about our dependence on notation and kind of how that ties into Western classical music, that kind of thing, which I think, yeah, it's probably a good stage to maybe talk about this, because I completely agree with Florrie that communication is everything, in terms of like creator to performer, performer to audience, and that kind of thing. I would qualify it though that like Western notation is like a very specific thing for Western classical music, and you know there are loads of extremely rich musical cultures that don't use notation. They're completely oral, not these like traditional Chinese music where it looks nothing like Western classical notation, and improvisation is huge. And I think Stevie has mentioned this as well, to do with Chaz as well in the comment. And so I think I would like kind of semi-agree with what you're saying, Florrie, but then kind of qualify that with the very specific framework in which we're talking about, which is Western art music. And so I guess the question then is like, if we are looking to include like historically marginalized communities or peoples, like what do we need to change to do that? And I do think notation is a part of that, because you know even nowadays, like the practicality of notation is that you need to have Sibelius, and Sibelius is extremely expensive. So you need a laptop, you need Wi-Fi to do these kind of things. So you know what are the assumptions here in saying that we do actually need notation, and then also then in terms of the delineation, sorry, of composer and performer. That is also a very Western classical music thing. And there are arguably more musics that don't have composers and are flourishing and will continue to flourish without that. And so I guess it's these kind of quite uncomfortable questions. I'm saying this as a very privileged person who has had a Western background, who also identifies as a composer. So I'm not like trying at all to take a moral high ground, but like kind of learn together. And so these are really important questions. I think it is important to continue questioning presumed structures like notation, for sure.
Yeah, to follow on, I mean, really, our tradition we're working in here, Western art music tradition, is really the only musical tradition in the world which has this composer-performer separation and this reliance on notated music. I mean, there's influences on a huge number of other types of music because it's been around for a long while. But really, we are, as composers, working in this very, very specific way, and in which basically no other kinds of musical culture are working. It's a unique thing, but it's somehow achieved this cultural dominance, hasn't it? That people value it very, very highly, though really it is. It's an artifact. We're writing in a very historical way, but we're keeping it going in a very new and modern way as well at the same time. I think that's probably where the interest lies.
But I see it's also evolving through your own notational styles and how you're developing that within your ideas.
Yeah, it's almost like we're working on new methods of cannon manufacture or castle design or something, but in the 21st century. It's an archaic skill, but still alive.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't agree that it's an archaic skill. I think it's just a tool. And again, it sort of goes back to how I was talking about earlier. I mean, I'm really interested in what Stevie Wishart says. Thank you, Stevie. I think it's a very, very good point. And I think you're absolutely right. By writing our music down or mostly writing our music down in this way, we are absolutely kind of, at least in terms of the kind of musicians who can play it and where they might play it, we are absolutely kind of putting ourselves in a Western classical tradition. But there's another way to look at it. Again, it's what I was saying earlier about the string quartet and its baggage. We can engage with that baggage, and we can and we can accept the baggage, and we can explore it, and we can choose to kind of carry the baggage very obviously, or we can choose to kind of leave it behind and catch the next flight, leaving it on the conveyor belt. We have choices, but I think the challenge with notation and non-notated music obviously is also about players. So, for example, I work, and again, as you say, it is Western classical musicians. They generally do like to have things written down for the most part. But I've been very lucky to work with. I mean, I suppose part of my quite open view on things like this is that I've been quite lucky to work with musicians who are excited about things like, classically trained musicians who are also working with improvisation in various different traditions. They're also exploring jazz, they're studying harmony. And who are very open stylistically and are really kind of interested in working in as many different ways as possible. So, for example, the string trio Cosmos that I've worked with my friend Harriet Mackenzie, they do a lot of improvising. Harriet's a very, very highly trained virtuoso violinist, but she also loves improvising. And so I can write a piece for her and for her group, which is largely notated because that's what I do, but will also include some improvisation, knowing the sort of thing that she and her group can do. They're doing a piece like that in a couple of days' time. It's not something I've explored terribly much because, again, it is about the people. Because, as we know, most classical string quartets will sit down and go, "Well, just give me some notes, let me play them." But even within that, there are many, many players who are very open to improvising and are quite happy to explore these things. And I think that's increasingly the case. So I think if we sort of draw the box and say, "Well, you're going to be a Western classical composer because you notate things," we can do that. We can kind of close ourselves down in that way and say, "Well, that's the end of that." That's who we are. Or we can say, well, most of the time we might notate things. Other times we might take a slightly different approach because the person in front of me that's going to be playing my music has the skills to work with it, work with what I'm presenting, and take and run with it and do more interesting things with it. I think, it's very much about that. And I think, again, with notation, rather than thinking about it as some sort of weird artifact that we're sort of carrying on, holding some kind of slightly pointless flame for, it's a very helpful tool, you know, and it's not the only tool, but it is a helpful tool that if you know how to use it, can be massively effective. It can also tie you down. And there are people who are, I think, very constrained by working, you know, tools. Any tool is going to give you something positive and something negative. It's going to constrain you in some way, and it's going to provide creative opportunities in some way. And so I think if you're conscious of that as a creative person, you can say, well, today I'm going to do this because I'm trying to achieve this. So you might be working on logic because the sort of sounds that you're working on are related using notation, whereas another day you might just need a notation because the type of work you're going to be doing is that. But I think if we can try to be flexible in our imaginations and work with people who can who are interested in that, I think there is a real space opening up to explore these things. And I think, if we approach it positively and think, okay, these are useful tools, but try to develop our as many tools as we can so we can use them productively in different contexts. I think that's the way for musicians to be open, build your skills, and have as many tools at your disposal, so that you can work in any context, I think. And obviously you're better at some than others, but that's just people. We're all good at some things and rubbish at others. So that's just, yeah.
That's a wonderful kind of rounding off of the session, I think, because I'm actually staggered to see that we've just reached our kind of time limit on this roundtable. And I can tell that the conversation could actually continue for another hour or two. I'm quite confident about that. So I would like to think that, you know, we continue to have these stimulating conversations with composers. And I'm absolutely delighted to have been able to chair this session and to hear your individual responses to issues of identity, diversity, and exclusivity as part of the Quartet Symposium. And I think, you know, it's a good takeaway to think about how we revisit and continue to revisit the terminology, aspects of listening, notation, orality, all those things that have come into the discussion. So I'd like to thank you all very much, Florrie, Alex, and Rob. And I really look forward to hearing, obviously we've heard your piece, Florrie, thank you so much for that. And later for Alex and tomorrow for Rob's pieces, to see how you can continue to enrich our British string quartet tradition. So thank you very much. And thank you also to the organisers for inviting me to chair this stimulating session. And I hope we can all help to keep the culture afresh, as Rob so neatly put it. Thank you very much.
Thank you
for all attending.
Yes.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye now.